All right. I leave it to you.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us on another one of these great conversations.
It's a conversation.
We are drinking this evening Great Scott IPA from Forest Lawn here in Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And this is going to be the last of these. We were actually just chatting before you all came on, that the next last Friday of the month is the day after Thanksgiving, and the last Friday of the month in December is Christmas. So we are going to take a bit of time off and then get back in January.
Yeah.
And that'll give us plenty of time to come up with.
I can't believe it's the beginning of November.
Yeah.
And it's kind of mind-numbing.
Yeah.
The year has gone both fast and slow.
And I kept saying that, beginning of November is so far off, and suddenly here
it is.
Yeah, so.
Well, tonight we're going to step back into some military history. We've been doing some cultural and medical scientific history the last few times. So we thought we'd step back around and think about the military history of the war. And what we wanted to do is think about, and this is something we talk about in the office all the time. We think about these Civil War campaigns. Oftentimes, because they're written in monographic form, most frequently, they end up being an isolated event that doesn't have a real continuity with other things. Oftentimes there's little nods to the next thing that's going to happen is going to be X or Y, but we like to look at things in a temporal way that really makes the connections and keeps the continuity of the experience more whole. It's not going to be as whole as it can be because that's impossible. But we can think a little bit more broadly about these campaigns and see how fast events happen. And tonight we're talking about the Sharpsburg campaign and the Gettysburg campaign. And to do that, we need to be thinking about what are the connections forward and backwards. And think about when Robert E. Lee becomes the commander of what becomes the Army of Northern Virginia. I mean, by the time the Battle of Sharpsburg happens, Lee has only been in command for 3 months. He's only had 3 months of experience leading this large army. It's the first large army he's ever led in his life. And he's now, here he is at the middle of September in one of the most famous campaigns in American military history, one of the most controversial campaigns in American military history, and one that has an incredibly important political impact with Lincoln issuing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on the heels of the Sharpsburg battle. Because that's something we need to think about too, is the larger political context of this. These campaigns, the first campaign we're going to talk about with Sharpsburg is really taking place at a transitional point in the war. The Union war aims are beginning to change. The politics of the North are changing. And remember that John Pope had been brought in from out west partly because he had been such a hard war guy that he wanted to take the war to the civilians, that he wanted to press the emancipationist logic of Northern politics. And that was the direction that the Lincoln administration had been going in since the beginning of 1862. And so the summer of 1862, there's a lot of conflict between people like Pope and Stanton on one hand, and then George McClellan and the officer corps of the Army of the Potomac on the other. So you've got their internal military politics that are at play here. There are politics in the way that the North is reoriented itself in 1862 that are in play here. And on the Confederate side, this is probably I think James McPherson argued that the Sharpsburg campaign really marked the high water mark of the Confederacy rather than Gettysburg. It's Sharpsburg because he makes the argument that there are two major offensives that are going on during this period: the invasion of Maryland, and then the Army of the Mississippi, soon to be the Army of Tennessee, and the Department of East Tennessee under Kirby Smith. Those troops invade Kentucky and stay in Kentucky until the middle part of October. And so that was militarily, it seems that's very much the the farthest extent of Confederate military influence over during the entire wartime period. So let's start with Sharpsburg.
Well, I just have
Go ahead. Go ahead.
quick comments. One is I tend to forget sort of how compact these events are. That Sharpsburg and Gettysburg are only 9 months apart, but they tend to seem like you've been saying, they tend to seem to happen just ages apart. But it really, the Civil War, at one point I said, the Civil War is short, and really it is, as far as looking at other wars that the United States has been involved in.
I mean, we can think very clearly back 8 months.
Right.
Where were we 8 months ago?
And we were going into quarantine.
We were going into quarantine, so this is all starting. So that just gives you a sense of how close in time these events are.
And the second thing is we are also at the same time that we're doing this program, we're also very deep into thinking about Robert Rhodes' advance up the Cumberland Valley in June of 1863. That's going to be part of our web series next week in conjunction with Giving Spree on Facebook. But it was interesting to be studying both of these at the same time. It sort of formed the backbone of this talk. But the time that Robert Rhodes spends north of the Potomac is just about the same time as the entire Maryland campaign. It's about two weeks. So thinking about how long the Gettysburg campaign is and everything that goes on even before the fighting starts versus this campaign, which is really compact.
And so let's start with the Sharpsburg campaign, but let's not start with September 3rd, 1863, which generally histories kind of want to pick up as Lee is beginning to make his move to cross the Potomac River, begins to move his army across the Potomac River. At the same time, George McClellan is reorganizing the Army of the Potomac and absorbing the Army of Virginia into that force. But I think it's important to step back just a little bit to think about the flow of military events in 1862 in Virginia and then in Maryland, because they are, I think, of one part of a whole. I generally think when I look at the campaigns, I think of the 7 days, the beginning of the 7 days campaign to the end of the Sharpsburg campaign towards let's say the 25th or so of September as one chunk, and then the next chunk as the initiative changes, as the orientations of the army change somewhat. Then you have a period with Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. I see those kind of as part of a whole, and then Gettysburg through the beginning of the Overland campaign being another period, and then the Overland campaign to include the Petersburg siege. So when you start chunking things together that way, you can begin to understand the ebbs and flows of military fortunes, the strategic outlook, the problems of supply, the political issues that are involved, and you begin to see those a little bit more fully. We were talking yesterday. We thought that we were kind of bemoaning the fact that nobody had written histories this way, but the problem with that is that you end up getting far too broad of a scope. This is I think that this is an easier thing to do in a spoken format than in a written format. Though one of y'all might probably figure out how to do it and write a brilliant book, and I'd be happy to see that. But anyway, for our purposes tonight, since there are no books that do it this way, we're going to do it this way. So let's think about timing, and let's think about what happens leading up to the point where why does Robert E. Lee make the decision to go into Maryland when he does? So if we back up, we know that Joseph E. Johnston is wounded at the Battle of Fair Oaks. Robert E. Lee takes command of the army. Lee had field command earlier in the war, had not been especially successful. He's a military advisor in Richmond when Johnston is wounded, and
in the right place.
And he's in the right place at the right time, and Lee takes over the army. And there's some consternation amongst some of the leadership and some of the soldiers, especially those who'd been with him in Western Virginia, or what was going to be in several months, West Virginia. They remembered that the failures, even failure, and a very tentative kind of approach that Lee took in those early campaigns. They called him Granny Lee, the King of Spades, because he wanted to dig entrenchments, and so it was not absolutely crystal clear when Robert E. Lee takes command in early June of 1862 that he's about to reel off one of the most phenomenal military campaigns in American history, starting with the 7 days and going all the way through Sharpsburg and carrying this momentum through. But there were some who knew Lee pretty well and said that he was the situation demands audacity, and this is something else that Pete and I talk about a lot is how aggressive Lee was in both of the invasions of the North, and why is he willing to take these long shots or these really big risky moves, and in Lee's mind. Those risks are necessitated by what he sees in the future. He knows that the Confederacy, or he thinks that the Confederacy is going to have to win very quickly, that they're going to have to break Northern political support and the morale of the North, and get Northerners to say this rebellion is not worth putting down.
And you look at his communications to Jefferson Davis leading up to both invasions, and he's basically saying the same thing, that we need to get Northern political support to recognize our independence. They're not going to be an army of conquest. They can't. That's not what they want. The way to do it is to get the support to push Lincoln over the edge, to just say, this is not working.
And in all the backdrop of 1862, we have to remember that Lee, while he's not known as being a political person, he's very well attuned to what politics and how politics are impacted by
the papers.
Yeah, he's reading the papers, and he's thinking about the anti-war faction in the North. He's thinking about these communities that had supported Lincoln, but Adams County is a great example, right? Adams County goes for Lincoln in 1860, but just barely.
51%.
Yeah, but in the 1862 congressional elections, Democrats sweep the table. So there are places in the northern, again, Adams County is a great example of that, where that tentative support for the Republican administration and the support for the war is being questioned, and being questioned politically, being questioned socially. And there's this undercurrent that Lee has picked up on, and it wasn't hard to pick up on, that there was conflict in the North about the direction of the war, about the especially as the Lincoln administration begins to take really increasingly aggressive steps towards turning the war into a war for not only the Union, but a war for emancipation and union.
And remember, it's 1862 is an election year.
Yeah, and so the late summer of 1862 is a great time to stir up all kinds of political problems. I don't know what that would feel like. I have no idea what a contested and contentious political campaign would look like or feel like. But anyway, that's the backdrop. That's part of the backdrop, because there are material problems too that are facing Lee. The manpower issue, he calculates very early in the war, and it's not hard to do. You can look at the 1860 census, and you can see what the military-aged pool of men from which to draw. You can see that very clearly, and Lee knew that it was a limited supply of men, and the battles that he was fighting were chipping away at that. He's very overt about that in the lead up to the Gettysburg campaign, and makes the argument that now is we're at our zenith. This is the best that we're ever going to be as far as manpower goes, because the North can continue to add men to the army, and with emancipation, it can add African American men to the army, which bolsters the forces of the United States all across the country. So Lee is aware of these things. He's aware of the problems that Virginia farmers are encountering, particularly in the wake of John Pope's command of the Army of Virginia. And the sense that you know, there's a major turn is not just something that Northerners are seeing, but Southerners are seeing this too. Private soldiers and officers and political leaders are all thinking about what emancipation really is going to mean for the war. And the stakes, especially in 1863, you see ministers and other cultural leaders really driving home the point that that the war has to be prosecuted to the end, because the emancipationist program of the Lincoln administration is going to destroy the Southern way of life. It's going to undermine the position of poor white men in the South. Really powerful arguments being made to encourage poor white men and middling white men to stay, and non-slaveholding white men to stay in the Army after the Gettysburg campaign. So we always have to be thinking about what's going on behind the lines, what's going on politically, what's going on in the Deep South. There's a drought that starts in early 1862. There's tremendous suffering, crop failures in North Georgia, Western North Carolina, East Tennessee, the western part of South Carolina. So the ability to feed the Army is being reduced. Union Army's success in the middle part of the continent are undermining the Confederacy's ability to get the raw materials they need to continue to make the manufactured goods that are going to supply the Army, and on and on and on. So we got to be thinking of these campaigns in a deep way as well, and thinking about what Lee is trying to achieve militarily to create Southern independence in a successful process, or a successful end of the war on Southern terms. So when Lee takes over command, he exhibits that audacity that Porter Alexander noted when Lee ascended to command. He's very aggressive in the 7 Days campaign. He takes the fighting to McClellan, pushes McClellan back all the way down away from the gates of Richmond. Makes some mistakes. Malvern Hill is a good example of I think of Lee's impatience and his belief in the offensive tactics. It's kind of like a Pickett's charge scenario. But at the end of the day, McClellan's army has been pushed down the peninsula, and it is appearing that they're going to be debarking from the peninsula pretty quickly. At the same time, John Pope has been brought over, and he's been brought over from Missouri by the Lincoln administration to organize the forces that had been fighting Stonewall Jackson in the Valley in the spring of 1862. He's going to take those three armies, put them together, and create a new military force. So this is going to be a cohesive, large army. It's the Army of Virginia. That's the army that fights at the Battle of Second Manassas. It's not McClellan's army that fights at Second Manassas. It's Pope's army that fights at Second Manassas. But the important thing to remember about Pope is not only is he representative of a different way of prosecuting the war, very aggressive and very pro-emancipationist, but when he gets to Virginia, at least for the first month or so of his command, his men pretty much run amok. Mm-hmm. They're destroying private property, and he thinks that he says, well, you know, it's basically what Sherman says a couple of years later about war being hell. He said war is destruction and death, and anybody that says anything different is fooling themselves. And the only way that we're going to win this war is to fight with our gloves off and take this war to the Southern population. It infuriates Southerners, and the newspapers are full of denunciations of Pope. They compare him to Benjamin Butler down in New Orleans. Just a really unpopular figure, and he does a lot of damage to the farms and to the farmers and the farm families in the Shenandoah Valley over the course of a month and a half or 2 months. And that is kind of the backdrop to the Second Manassas campaign. Lee is personally very interested in defeating Pope. It's almost like a personal grudge in a way, and it's fueled by this sense that he's going outside the bounds of civilized warfare. George McClellan would have said the same thing. George McClellan did say the same thing. Mm-hmm. And his supporters in the Army of the Potomac were not happy about this turn. So we've got the 7 Days campaign that ends on July 1st at the Battle of Malvern Hill. At the same time, Pope's army is being organized in northern Virginia, in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and that leads to a real problem, a strategic problem for Lee and the Confederates. You've got a large army on the peninsula that looks like it's about to pull off of the peninsula, but you also have a large army in Northern Virginia of 50 or so thousand men who could come down from the valley, come across the mountains and attack Richmond from that direction. So there's a strategic problem that Lee is facing. How do I deal with these two armies, and how do I keep them from getting together and forming this huge combination that would lead to an army of what, 160,000 men? It's a difficult problem. And so what he does, as he frequently did, he divided his army. He left Longstreet's forces over near Richmond so they could watch McClellan, and send Stonewall Jackson over into the valley area, over towards Charlottesville, and then up towards Gordonsville, and up through the area around Orange Courthouse. Jackson fights on August 9th, the Battle of Cedar Mountain, wins the fight there. And then Lee takes a chance, and he's pretty sure that McClellan's guys are getting back on the boats, but he thinks that he needs to take Longstreet's troops from Richmond, march them to join up with Stonewall Jackson, and beat John Pope's army. And this is July 1st is when the 7 Days campaign ends. August 9th is the Battle of Cedar Mountain, and then by the end of August, you see the Second Battle of Manassas.
And something that we talk about a lot around here, especially as related to the Gettysburg campaign, is Lee taking chances, but also being the best case scenario. That this is going to work. And I think that I want to say that now, because I think that's going to be a thread that we're going to pick up on, and probably is going to take us through a lot of the rest of this talk. And it's a little bit.
That's Joe Harsh's. Those are his words. We didn't come up with that ourselves, but it makes a whole lot of sense. And
but we've looked at that was an Antietam. Joe Harsh's Antietam interpretation, and if you apply it to the Gettysburg campaign, as we are going to do in a couple of minutes here, we're going to say the same thing. We're going to look at what he does here in South Central Pennsylvania, and drastically splitting his forces even more so than he does as they're trying to take Harper's Ferry in September of '62. And it puts him in a bind, puts him in a real bind in both cases. Now he's able to fight his way out of it, but at great cost.
His response to that was, well, I have to take chances. And that's how he kind of positioned it. We have to take chances. This is a long shot in general.
And I'm not saying that the chances are a bad thing.
Right.
And I want to make sure that because what are the other choices? And I think that and that's what he is thinking as he's standing there on Ox Hill after the Battle of Ox Hill, or Chantilly for you Northerners out there. Where do you go? What do you do?
I mean, the Second Manassas campaign was masterful. At the time, it was the largest battle in American military history. The largest number of men engaged.
For 3 more weeks.
For a few more weeks, it's a huge battle, and it's a resounding Confederate victory. It embarrasses John Pope. John Pope is most certainly on his way out the door by the first day of September 1862. So Lee takes these chances. He splits his army. His army is split in half. They march fast. Everything goes their way. And this is something that's really important to think of with Lee. He's been damn successful already, and he continues to be successful. And every time he rolls the dice, he comes up with a winner. And there's a sense in his mind, he's a providential guy. He believes that all human activity is in God's hands. And he's seeing these chances turn up winners time and time and time again.
Doesn't know when to hold them or when to fold.
He doesn't know when to walk away.
Walk away.
But he did know when to run.
Yeah.
A couple of times. Wow. How do we work the gambler into that? That's great. I love it.
You said the G word.
I know. Who did he bum a cigarette from?
I don't
know. Anyway, so what was I talking about?
He's rolling the dice.
He's rolling the dice. He's coming up big.
And that has to be factoring into his thinking.
And
Because
it's factoring into the thinking of his soldiers and his subordinate officers. They think by the time they are already arguing. Soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia and officers in the Army of Northern Virginia are already arguing that after the 7 Days Campaign, that Lee was the greatest general of all time, and that the military campaigns that had happened with Jackson in the Valley in the spring of '62, and then the 7 Days Campaign. That the Confederate Army couldn't be beat, that God was on their side. It's being manifest in these victories. We shouldn't be winning these battles, but we are, and God has his hand firmly on the Confederate shoulders and is guiding them to victory.
it's a strong
cultural argument. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got the material evidence, and then he's got the cultural interpretation that allows for this sense of military invincibility to build up very, very quickly amongst these soldiers. And so, Second Manassas campaign, again, it's masterful. The dividing army comes together at the right time, at the right place, and it smashes Pope's army, sends them retreating back towards Washington, D.C., and the Confederates follow them up. What Lee continues to do in all of his campaigns really is to march and maneuver to force the enemy into different spaces in different places, and he does it very, very well. And his moves in the Second Manassas campaign drew the United States Army out of Northern Virginia. They've drawn themselves off of the peninsula, and they are suddenly confronted with a situation that they hadn't been.
And he's going to do it. He's going to do it again.
Yeah.
Two more times.
Yeah. So
in Maryland and Gettysburg.
Yeah. So he after the Second Manassas battle happens, and Pope's army is retreating back, and the Army of the Potomac, as some of the troops are coming in to help bolster Pope's position. Lee continues to pursue. He pursues towards Washington. And he gets to the area around where Dulles Airport is now, and fights a battle called Ox Hill or Chantilly. But that's a reasonably inconclusive fight. But he realizes at that point that he doesn't have any more room to maneuver because the Potomac River is to his north, and creates problems for moving in that northeasterly direction. And the fortifications around Washington, D.C. are so formidable, there's no way that they can take Washington by storm.
And he says as much to
Jefferson
Davis. He says, I have no desire to go towards Washington.
And so this is September 2nd, September 3rd, he begins to shuffle towards the left. That would be the northeast. It'd be moving towards Harper's Ferry. I think I saw a question about maps here just a second ago. We could probably,
knowing the geography.
We'll get there in just a second, Sean. But that is something. The geography is most certainly critically important here. Where the Potomac River is, where the fortifications around Washington, D.C. are, where the roads are, where the railroads are, where the canals are, where the mountains are, all determine where Lee can go. And so he finds himself the first week of September looking at these defenses in Washington, D.C. and says, no way I can get there. Well, I can continue to maneuver, and the only place to maneuver is to the left towards Leesburg, and then up towards Frederick, Maryland. And he does that. He moves the army to Leesburg, has a couple of days rest after Chantilly, or a day's rest after Chantilly, and writes a note to Jefferson Davis on September 3rd, speculating about whether it would be a good idea to go on into Maryland. Well, he's already made his mind up. He's gone to Maryland. Part of his forces are already crossing the river by the time Jefferson Davis reads the letter. And off we go into the Sharpsburg campaign. So think about the timing here for a second. So last day of August is the last day of the Battle of Second Manassas. By the 3rd of September, Robert E. Lee's crossing the river.
And I think that one of the things that tends to trip people up on that, first of all, you're 2 months, you're in 2 separate months.
2 separate months. Yeah, it seems like a long time, right?
Summer versus August is a summer month, September is a fall month.
Yeah.
It seems like it should be so far apart.
Yeah, and
4 days.
it's seamlessly happening. The decision that was made at Chantilly was the decision to move to the left, to move to the north, and then to maneuver the Army of the Potomac out of Washington, D.C. and into a open field fight somewhere north of the Potomac River.
And you know, he does have there are two other choices, that he can go back south or he can go further west into the Shenandoah Valley. But you know, he's definitely not going to give up the initiative by retreating back south. And the Shenandoah Valley, you can get some time out of that, but that you're not going to be able to stay there too long, and you're going to be hurting your citizens, civilians.
You can't build up the backstock you need to get through the winter.
Yeah. And that's, can I talk about?
Go ahead, talk about
foraging. So in both cases, Gettysburg, Antietam and Gettysburg, there's a lot of focus on how are we going to live in the enemy's country? How are we going to supply ourselves? How are we going to eat? And this factors into Lee's thinking as he crossed the Potomac into Maryland. He's thinking that we're going to get all the forage and provisions that we need. Well, he gets to Frederick and writes a letter to Jefferson Davis not long after they get to Frederick. Well, we have the forage we need. We can feed the horses, but we don't have the provisions.
Right. So
now I got to supply the provisions from a wagon train up the valley or down the valley, and that's where the Harper's Ferry comes in. Don't want to talk about that quite yet, but even during the Gettysburg campaign, as they're preparing for the Gettysburg campaign, this is weighing heavily on Lee's mind. This idea of what were we able to get out of Maryland in terms of food 9 months earlier, and he writes a communication to Richard Ewell. As Ewell is sitting on the banks of the Potomac.
This is Gettysburg.
Gettysburg, the Gettysburg campaign. At this time, Ewell was probably sitting in a bed somewhere in August and early September of 1862. He's back in Richmond. He's just lost his leg. But fast forward to the Gettysburg campaign, Ewell is sitting on the banks of the Potomac around Shepherdstown, and Lee says to him, "Move into Pennsylvania. You'll have to see if you can get the provisions to live on. There may be enough for your command, but there may not be enough for the rest for the other two corps." So this idea that Lee is moving into Pennsylvania, knowing that, confident that he's going to be able to feed his army off the land, is sort of suspect. Because I think he expects to, he wants to. But he's even up until June 22nd. Well, he's not sure.
He had invaded Maryland during the harvest season and couldn't feed his army.
And he talks about how the millers and other people don't want, the farmers haven't brought in their crops yet, and the millers and other people don't want to help us out, which actually opens up a discussion about what he's also trying to do in Maryland.
And somebody just asked a question a minute ago, is what was the intelligence about the Maryland population?
Oh, yeah.
Well, he thought that they would come flocking to the banner. Same approach that Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg were making in Kentucky at the very same time.
Which is another question.
There's no coordination. There's no evidence that this was a coordinated move. Bragg's Kentucky campaign certainly had everything to do with the local conditions. The Middle Tennessee had fallen. Union forces were along the Memphis and Charleston Railroad in North Alabama. They're closing in on Chattanooga, and Bragg really has to make his calculations are based on what's happening in Tennessee. And what he does is he picks his army up from Corinth and moves it to Mobile and then up to Atlanta and then to Chattanooga, and really seizes the initiative in the Western campaigns at that point. But those were considerations that were very much local in their orientation, and they were responding to specific strategic needs in the Western theater. Remember, and Pete's been making a lot about the planning and the thoughtfulness that goes into the Gettysburg campaign. Robert E. Lee makes his mind up. He has something of an idea, maybe sort of as he goes on the Second Manassas campaign, that moving across the river might be something he wants to do, that he wants to go and tap into this manpower that's imagined to be in Maryland. Had he been on the Eastern Shore, he might have had some success there. But he wasn't. He was.
And they're bringing guns up. They're bringing guns
and Bragg does the same thing.
Yeah. It's not until he gets to Frederick and he And he writes back, and what's really interesting is that he is in almost constant communication with Davis from the 3rd through the 13th. Yeah. It's like every day he's writing a communication to Davis. So you have, and they're all in the official record. So you have a great window into Lee's changing thinking as they go through. You know, oh, we have all the foraging provisions we need. Oh, no, we don't. Oh, they're going to come and flock to us. Oh, no,
they didn't. Yeah.
What was I going to say? Oh, but the idea of planning that, you know, this is maybe he has an idea that he's going to go into Maryland. Well, I think that it's the 31st or the 1st that he makes that final.
Yeah. That's the preponderance of evidence is that after Second Manassas, when he gets up against the fortifications in D.C., he has a strategic conundrum in front of him. How do we keep that? And this is something he talks about: is how do we keep this momentum going? Because he wants to keep the momentum going no matter what.
And I want to compare that to the Gettysburg campaign, because I think that he knows from the winter of 62-63 that he wants to go back into.
Well, we know that by February he's having meetings in Richmond. We don't have any records. It's one of those maddening things. There are no records of these meetings, but Lee is in Washington or in Richmond talking about what the summer campaigns need to look like.
And I think that even before that, he and Jackson meet with Jed Hotchkiss to draw a map all the way up to Harrisburg. So I think that the fact that he's having this map drawn is clear evidence that he's not going to have Jed Hotchkiss do it just
for grins. There's plenty of other stuff to do.
So he recognizes the drawbacks in the Maryland campaign. How quickly does he get his army through Maryland during the Gettysburg campaign? I mean, they barely even see. There are a lot. How many of the Confederate accounts you say we had breakfast in Virginia, lunch in Maryland, and dinner in Pennsylvania? So he knows. You know, he chooses to cross the Potomac at like the shortest part of Maryland there is. And he's not going to dally at all because it's a lost cause. We've done it. We've been there. It doesn't work.
Western Maryland and Eastern Maryland are totally different areas. Western Maryland is far more like Pennsylvania ethnically, economically than the Eastern Shore where you have your large plantations. It's the difference between the coastal areas of North Carolina and the mountains of North Carolina.
They're talking about the ugly Dutch in Pennsylvania and in Maryland. So let's talk about the Maryland campaign in a little bit more detail and talk about what, you know, one of the, there's some myths about the Maryland campaign and it's easy to dismiss George McClellan because he was quote unquote slow. Well, how slow was he? How much intelligence did he have to draw from? What were the decisions that he was making in real time? The same thing with Lee. What are the decisions that he's making in real time, and what are and how are things playing out from that perspective? Because it's easy to look back and say, well, he should have just pushed right down the National Road and gone right through to Boonesboro. It's easy to say that, but you know, you're looking at rugged terrain, you're looking at mountainous terrain, you're away from the railroads. You know, it's risky business. I mean, military, you know, moving an army through these big spaces is risky business. And I think that's a big thing. And I was just, before this, I was reading Jonathan Letterman, and I hope we can talk just briefly about that at the end. But the idea that both armies are operating far, far, far away from a railhead, and are having to, and Letterman is talking about it in reference to getting supplies and wounded back and forth between Frederick and Antietam and Sharpsburg. But the idea of trying to move all this stuff.
And remember that the Gettysburg campaign is very different in a lot of ways than Sharpsburg. But I don't think there's any more important difference for Lee's army, at least, is what was the physical condition of his army. If you think about it, you know, he's rolled the dice in the 7 days campaign, massive casualties, lost, you know, huge numbers of officers and leadership, and that this is a hallmark of Lee's army because he's fighting these aggressive battles and these Southern officers are leading from the front and they're getting killed and they're getting wounded. And that's a big problem. You have a command continuity problem. I mean, it's hard to follow the organization of Lee's brigades and divisions because the division and brigade commanders are changing so frequently. as a result of this combat. And they're also marching themselves out of their supplies. One of the problems that Lee has in the initial phases of the Sharpsburg campaign is that he's got a bunch of barefooted men. They have just marched themselves out of shoes, literally. It's not necessarily the ability of Southerners to make shoes. It's just you wear them out on these macadamized roads. You wear them out over the course of the long marches of the Second Manassas campaign, and they go right into the Sharpsburg campaign. There literally is no pause.
All right, yeah.
Chantilly, then you're across the river, and then South Mountain. I mean, South Mountain is exactly 2 weeks from the end of the Battle of Second Manassas. Think about that. The Battle of South Mountain is only 2 weeks removed from the end of the Battle of Second Manassas.
And think about and the men of D.H. Hill's division that are fighting at South Mountain have marched the least amount of any of Lee's guys. You look at Jackson and everybody else has marched even further. Yeah, so
Lee launches this invasion to keep the momentum going, to bring in Maryland volunteers, to get some food out of Maryland, and to perhaps disrupt the political season of 1862. And he thinks the risks are reasonable. And we could argue for years, and people have for years, about how reasonable it was to make this move. Well, the man that was making the decisions thought it was absolutely the right move, and his men thought the same thing.
And his president didn't reel him in.
And his president didn't reel him in. Although Lee was a little sneaky with this. Lee didn't want Davis to cut. Davis tried to get up to Lee to have a meeting.
Yeah.
And he's kind of given the runaround, and I'm across the river.
I think Lee plays a little fast and loose.
Lee plays very fast and loose with Davis for about a week and a half.
Yeah.
But
what are you going to do? What is Davis going to do? Fire him?
Yeah.
I mean, he's
suddenly become the hero of the Confederacy.
Yeah,
the Army of the Potomac, then the Army of Northern Virginia, has become the Confederacy rapidly.
Right.
Gary Gallagher makes a great point that the Confederacy really was Lee's army, and this is when that sense of national success really got melded to the success of Robert E. Lee's army. So the campaign begins. Lee moves across the river. He takes some time and camps around Frederick. And one of the calculations, he makes some calculations, and not all of the calculations were accurate. Obviously, we already know that people didn't flock to the cause. There wasn't enough food to eat. And he also makes a calculation that it would take weeks. It would take weeks for McClellan to reorganize the Army of the Potomac and then absorb Pope's Army of Virginia that had been beaten so badly at the Battle of Second Manassas. So he makes a calculation about timing. And it's the same thing he does with
George.
He's taking stock of Mr. F.J. Hooker in the spring of in the late spring of 1863. But he thinks it's going to take McClellan a long time to get the army organized and then moving. And that's the biggest miscalculation that he makes.
And as we said yesterday, we were sitting in Daryl's office talking about this, and we agreed that if there's something that you can really give McClellan, if you can say that something that he does excellent, it's organization. Yep. And he is moving his headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Rockville the same day that Lee starts crossing the Potomac.
And Rockville is only 16, 18 miles from the river?
Something, yeah.
From Point of Rocks to Rockville can't be more than 25 miles.
So he's moving cautiously. He is. And I think, part of that is that he doesn't know what Lee is doing. And he's not going to make some big drastic move until he knows and there's some threat that or some consideration that maybe Lee is making a move on Baltimore. He's having Burnside cover the National Road. So, McClellan is moving slowly, but he is also moving quickly.
He's also moving quickly. I mean, it's you got to remember, this is kind of getting ahead of the game, but when Robert E. Lee makes the decision to stop on the hills outside of Sharpsburg on the 15th of September, after the Battle of South Mountain, Lee's been up 25, 30, 40 hours at this point. He gets to a point on the north bank of the Antietam Creek, and he looks across and he sees the ground that he's going to put his line on. 10 hours later, well, let me back up another half step. 3 hours later, Joe Hooker's standing there looking at the same view. 7 hours after that, George McClellan's in the same spot looking at the same position. So that's how close McClellan is staying on Lee's army, especially after the Battle of South Mountain. He really stays on top of Lee. You can fault him for perhaps not exerting enough control over some of his corps commanders who aren't acting as aggressively. The second and first corps, Hooker and his Sumner's commanding the second corps. They get kind of tangled up on the Boonesboro Road on the 15th of September. But McClellan's right there and gets things straightened out. So I think that it's a little bit uncharitable for historians to really hammer McClellan for dragging his feet, because there's no foot dragging going on at all.
He picks up the pace. He really hits the throttle after the 12th. He takes it takes him 9 days to get from Rockville to the outskirts of Frederick, but they're trying to take Sugarloaf Mountain in the middle of that to find out what the heck is going on.
But Sugarloaf, you can see,
it's a great finally gets guys up on Sugarloaf Mountain, finally gets a signal corps up there. He recognizes, okay, the only thing between here and the mountains are a couple of regiments of cavalry. And that's when I think he really hits the gas.
And this is one of those places, I think, that the reputation of Jeb Stuart has come down through the Lost Cause narrative as he's the great cavalier and he's this romantic figure, but his military career was reasonably uneven. So
it's a diplomatic way.
Well, I think it is. I think it is. I think that he does some really astute things over the course, but he also does some really dumb things.
Yeah.
And again, getting back to this notion of how close McClellan is following. When Lee begins to move his army across the South Mountains and starts to make towards Hagerstown and then up into Pennsylvania, Stuart's cavalry corps is left behind to observe the Federal troops marching up from Buckystown and Urbana up the Urbana Pike, and keep in contact. Well, Stuart leaves Frederick, and he goes across, and those of you who are familiar with the area, he goes across the Catoctin Mountains and down across Pleasant Valley and then down towards Harper's Ferry. And he's completely out of
he goes to, as he thinks that the greatest threat to the Confederate Army at that point is McLaws' rear.
Yeah.
McLaws is up on Maryland Heights along Elk Mountain, and he thinks, and Stuart thinks, that somebody is going to come through Crampton's Gap and get on McLaws' rear, and leaves the door wide open to
Fox's Gap and the Turner's
Gap. And if not for the attention that D.H. Hill is paying, and
Mumford's cavalry does a lot of work here, but it's just a very few Confederate forces that are in front of or between Lee's army that's been badly divided. We need to talk about the dividing of the army in a second.
And we're running.
Oh my God!
10 minutes.
Holy smokes!
But I want to talk a little bit, because one of the things that I said earlier was, and borrowing from Harsh, is that he's the best case scenario general. And one of the things that Lee assumes, make an ass of you and me, is that the Harper's Ferry and Martinsburg garrisons are going to fold. And I think that is maybe his second biggest miscalculation during the Antietam campaign, that they're gonna walk away.
Because he thinks that operation is going to be wrapped up by the 12th and the 13th.
Well, first, he doesn't think he's going to have an operation. Right. He thinks that they're going to go without a fight. And then in Special Orders 191, the famous orders, which he's writing on September 9th, Jackson gets on the road 3 a.m. on September 10th. Lee thinks that that's all going to be wrapped up by the morning of the 12th, that Jackson's going to have it all done in about 48 hours. And when does Harper's Ferry fall? The 15th?
15th. Morning of the 15th is when they finally.
So, and then the other thing that Lee is not taking into consideration is if there is going to be a threat from Pennsylvania. And so, Lee has split his army up. He has Walker down on the other side of the Potomac River. He has McLaws on Maryland Heights. He has Jackson on Bolivar Heights.
Yep.
And Longstreet and D.H. Hill are supposed to stay together and stay around the Boonesboro area with the reserve artillery and the wagon trains. Well, there is a phantom threat, and you see these phantom threats show up in the Pennsylvania campaign too. That's what's going to draw Longstreet up to Hagerstown and leave D.H. Hill holding the on the
14th. I mean, just think about it on the 4th. So what happens is McClellan comes into Frederick hot on the heels of Stuart's cavalry. Yep. Stuart's cavalry retreats across the Catoctin Mountains all the way across Pleasant Valley. Doesn't put up any. So what has, I guess the big question to ask is, what has Stuart seen and how is he interpreting it when he's coming out of Frederick? Who does he see? Because the Confederate infantry that are on the mountain on the morning of the 14th say that it looks like the Yankees are crawling out of the ground. They're so thick.
And the other thing that's happening that Scott Hartwig talks about in his book is that one of the pieces of information that Stuart gives to Lee, Stuart finds a Confederate sympathizer who comes to him and says, McClellan found something important, and likely it was Orders 191. This Confederate sympathizer was in McClellan's camp, and McClellan was making this huge, big old deal about the found something.
Exactly where I want him.
And that filters by 10 o'clock on the 13th, 10 hours, 12 hours after they find him, Orders 191. Lee knows that something is up. So I would argue that maybe that's the most important piece of advice that Stuart gives to Lee.
Quite possibly, yeah. But he certainly doesn't do the type of reconnaissance work or guarding the passes that Lee would necessarily need.
Which he does do in the Gettysburg campaign.
Yes, and so even in this campaign, I mean, there are examples. He doesn't do a good job at South Mountain. He's out of position at South Mountain. He's ignoring the evidence that's in front of him at South Mountain, from Frederick to South Mountain. He's not doing any kind of rear guard activity. I think he concludes that the main effort's going to be rear and not down the federal road or the national road. He can conclude what he wants to, but there's not a lot of curiosity exhibited by Jeb Stuart in that phase of the campaign. Now he gets to Sharpsburg. And he's looking at the Confederate line, and he's the one who chooses the artillery line on Nicodemus Heights. Yep. So there's blame and there's things to say that he did well during the campaign, but in this essential moment when the United States Army is pushing towards South Mountain, while Lee's army is 4 divisions at Harper's Ferry, 1 in Boonesboro, 2 up in Hagerstown. They are spread way out when McClellan's army forces the passes at South Mountain
under one of the best commanders that they have right there, under Ninth Corps and Reno, and it's McClellan is leading with probably his most powerful.
Yeah. He's got Hooker up there.
Yeah, I would argue that Hooker and Reno are his 2 best commanders.
By this point, Reno or Hooker has gained the reputation as being the most aggressive of the Corps commanders. So he was
always a good Corps commander.
He was a great Corps commander, and he was a great Army commander. He commands the 20th Corps in the Atlanta campaign. So his only failure really was, well, there were a couple of failures. His moral ethical failures, and then which makes him unpopular in some circles
I mean,
and then his failure at Chancellorsville. But in any case, when the Union troops forced the passage of the South Mountains, I bet there are not 4,000 Confederates on top of that hill. Cavalry, infantry, artillery, all together.
Do we want to take some questions? I almost think that we're going to have to do a part 2.
We'll have to do a part 2. Yeah.
I don't think that we knew that there was going to be. I think we maybe knew that there was going to be
a lot.
To talk about.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
We're trying. This is why people don't write books like this, right?
Right.
Just to say it.
Yeah.
All right.
Wasn't McClellan kind of hobbled by incorrect reconnaissance reports about the size of enemy's troops? I think that he's hobbled by it. That's certainly. I mean, the whole time that he is advancing from Rockville to Frederick, he's grossly conflating the numbers, and if that follows through the battle. But he doesn't have somebody who is analyzing. I mean, he's taking Pinkerton's and Pleasanton's numbers at face value. He doesn't have a George Sharp yet.
Right.
And as we maybe get into talking about the Gettysburg campaign more the next time we do this, talking about the role that George Sharp and the Bureau of Military Intelligence plays that can kind of make sure that the information is correct. Whereas he's just seeing these numbers, these raw numbers come in, and he's making. And I know Hartwood talks about this again in his book about, McClellan is they're not quite arbitrary numbers, but he's looking at orders 191, and he's applying numbers to. He knows that the Army of Northern Virginia is split up, and he is estimating and just applying numbers to where everybody is.
Well, and he's not randomly applying them.
No,
he's applying them from what he knows at the table of organization,
right?
Civil or military organization. He doesn't realize that some regiments in Lee's army are down to 100 to 150 men, down from 1,000.
And
so
there's a huge what he doesn't know, and I don't know. Well, he could figure this out if he used the cavalry, but there's a huge straggling problem in Lee's army at this point.
They're marched out of their shoes, but they're also having problems with dysentery. There's a great George Templeton Strong comes down as a volunteer relief agent after the Battle of Sharpsburg. He said we could see where the Confederates had been, where Confederate bivouac had been from the corn husks that were on the ground, and then behind piles of human excrement, of dysenteric human excrement, and so diarrhea is having a huge impact on the ability of Lee's army to keep men in the ranks. Straggling had always been a problem, but the dehydration and the lack of shoes certainly exacerbates what was already a problem in Lee's army.
And according to John Walker, the division commander, Lee says we're going to stop. It was always my intention to stop in Hagerstown for a few days to let everybody catch up. Yeah.
Because it's not just that they've marched into Maryland. They had been marching since the beginning of August. They had been moving and fighting almost 2 months. It's almost 2 months, really.
It seems to me Lee's decision to fight at Sharpsburg was a military blunder he got away with. Do either of you think he should have withdrawn across the Potomac on 9/16?
He did get away with it, and there are, E.P. Alexander says very clearly that Lee's worst strategic decision of the entire war was to fight at Sharpsburg, because the best he could do was a drawn battle. And Lee himself, but Lee himself was thinking about going back on the offensive. He thought that after the disaster at South Mountain, after the delay of capturing Harper's Ferry, once he got the army kind of back in hand on the 15th, and he found out that Harper's Ferry had retreated and that Jackson could join the army, Lee is actually thinking about going back, because between the evening of the 14th and the midday of the 15th, Lee is thinking about protecting McLaws and then getting back across the river. He's given orders. He's already sent his main ordnance train under E.P. Alexander across the river at Williamsport. He's pulling back 2 wagon trains from the Hagerstown area with instructions to go across the river at Williamsport. So he's late night 14, early morning 15, he's thinking about getting the army back together and getting the hell out of Maryland. But when he finds out that, and everything that he does on the 15th was to position the main wing of the army, which is D.H. Hill and Longstreet and these troops who had been at South Mountain, is to put them in a position to help McLaws, because McLaws is going to be cut off if there's some way to come back to the army. And hold on just for 2 seconds. So Lee is actually thinking once the Jackson says, I'm coming back to you, Lee wants to protect the Hagerstown Road. And one of the reasons he positions the army, beyond the fact that it was an incredibly strong position for the most part, the area around Sharpsburg allowed him to have access to the Hagerstown Road. And he's already thinking about fighting a battle and then continuing the offensive campaign by moving to Hagerstown up the pike.
And he's playing the man.
Yeah.
I think that he talks a lot about playing on McClellan.
Yeah.
And I think that, whether or not McClellan is moving quickly, it's really about what Lee thinks he is
right.
doing or is going to
and
do.
That's the whole thing about military intelligence.
Yeah.
You have to take the intelligence and the information
Right.
you have and then make and draw conclusions. And Lee is drawing conclusions, but he's historically, now we can say this about the way he looks at McClellan, the way he looks at F.J. Hooker, certainly the way he looks at Burnside, but then the way he looks at Hooker, and then the way he reads Meade. They're all wrong. They're
all wrong. But he doesn't. I'm sure he doesn't think that. I mean, I think that he's looking at McClellan through the lens of, and he says this to Walker again about I knew him on Scott's staff in Mexico, but he's also looking about how he whipped him on the peninsula.
Yeah.
And even if they fight a battle on somewhere around Sharpsburg on this whatever it was 15, 16, 17. That is McClellan going to get unnerved like he did
and freeze?
And he did on the 7 days. So, I think there's a lot of him playing the man here.
Yeah. It's calculation. I think that it could be very. Had the line broken, certainly it's a blunder. If McClellan acts like he does on the peninsula, he pulls back to Boonesboro or goes back into the mountain passes to protect Washington and Baltimore, that leaves that whole corridor up through the Cumberland Valley wide open for Robert E. Lee. So we don't have enough evidence from Lee's pen or his staff's pen to say that with certainty, but certainly we know enough about how Lee's thinking changed between the early morning of the 15th of September and the afternoon of the 15th of September when he's making these decisions that are clearly looking towards a resumption of aggressive activity. There's a question about the gaps in the mountains. Let's see. Can you speak to the tactical decisions made by both sides during the campaign? The terrain is actually fairly, it's very open and rolling to the east of South Mountain, Pleasant Valley. You get to the Catoctin Mountains.
West of.
No, I'm thinking
Pleasant Valley is west of it.
Yes. All the ground from South Mountain to Frederick is fairly rolling. Yeah. It's not, you've got the Catoctin Mountains. It's a little bit of a chore to get through, but then you have open ground between Catoctin and South Mountains, and then the passes are very difficult. And had the passes been well guarded and well defended, then Lee's not looking at, oh my God, McClellan is through the mountains and he's on my rear, and I got to make some fast decisions.
And that's one of the considerations for the Gettysburg campaign, both, and maybe it's more of a historic consideration, is why is he not making a stand at Cashtown Pass or making a stand at Monterey Pass and using the passes to his advantage, which is sort of what happens at South Mountain.
Yeah.
They're using, D.H. Hill is up there and he's making the Union Army attack him.
Yeah, but there are not enough guys that are committed to
Not
that
enough
mission.
guys right there.
They don't have the right people in the right place to do the things that would be necessary to bottle them up. And so the terrain in Fox and in the gaps is critical in that, or is difficult in that it could have been a major impediment for for McClellan to get to Lee's army and make the threats or create the threat that he does create. And the ground, the Sharpsburg, where the Sharpsburg battle is fought, the ground is great for a defender, except for the left flank up towards the Dunker Church, and then the Nicodemus Heights position plays into that. But it's not terrible ground, and it's not ground that doesn't have advantages. And remember that Lee and McClellan both are engineers. And they can look at the ground. They understand the ground. They do the reconnaissance work. They have staff officers who are out and looking around. So, in fact, Lee first thinks he's going to stop at Keysville, which is north of the river and north of the town of Sharpsburg. But his engineers get out and look around and say, "This is a terrible place to be. There's this and this problem. You're going to be an enfilade." So Lee then moves back towards the river and he sees the position or the ridges around Sharpsburg and says, "This is a great place to defend, bring the army back together and defend." So there was another one up top. Did we get to that?
I think we got to that one. The Bragg.
Yeah, I can talk about Bragg for days.
The intelligence, the support, hobbled by. I think we got all of it. Well.
Wow.
I think we're going to do part 2.
Yeah, we'll have to do part 2.
Yeah. This, I think.
Because we hadn't even fought the battle. We hadn't even talked about the medical stuff. So.
Yeah. So this will be fun. We'll, this will be our bookends. Pick up something to leave off with, and then we're going to pick up with.
Yeah, this is kind of like cliffhanger on television, right? This is the end of the season, and then next.
JR got shot.
JR got shot. That's exactly what happened. Right? JR shot. Who shot JR? So there's going to be a whole, all of this time between now and January. Everybody's going to be wondering who shot JR, and I'll have T-shirts made.
All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful holiday season.
Yes.
We look forward to seeing you next year. Next Thursday, during the day, we are going to be. So Daryl and Rob and I spent all day last Thursday, out on the road, following Robert Rhodes' advance from Williamsport to Carlisle and then to Heidlersburg. So we have 7, I think, videos that we're going to be posting on our Facebook page throughout the day. You don't need a Facebook account. You can have access to these. And we're going to be telling some really interesting stories from the Rhodes advance up the Cumberland Valley, the furthest north the Confederates get during the Gettysburg campaign. So,
and that's all in association with the Adams County Community Foundation's Giving Spree. And there are opportunities. I'm sure all of you have gotten emails and hard mail about the Giving Spree. It's an opportunity to make end-of-year contributions to the museum count for even more. There's a stretch pool. So depending on the percentage of the total take that we get that same percentage of that stretch pool. So it's a great opportunity to make end-of-year gifts go that much further. So we have a $7,500 goal for that. Follow us on the tour and do what you can. And y'all all know it's been a tough year. We know it's been a tough year for everybody. So we're looking forward to sharing with y'all and having a good virtual legacy tour.
Yeah.
So
all right. Well, have a good evening, everybody. Have a good weekend, and we'll hope to see you on the ridge soon.
Thank you, guys.
y'all take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. Have a happy holiday season.
You too, Rob. Take care.
Thank you.